lovely topic on reshaping funding and governance. We had a good chat around care models, we went through a lot of conversations and topics through that. Robert, shall I start with you, because you have a fair spread of services under your umbrella. In terms of, give us an overview on funding and regulation and funding and governance, how it plays in that multi-service, multi-practice portfolio.
Yep, thank you. So hi, I'm Robert Sims. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of CatholicCare, Central Queensland. So we provide services in Central Queensland between Bundaberg and Mackay, for those who know the area. So it's a fairly wide geographical spread, with some large large regional towns. Rockhampton, about 100,000 people, all the way up to Longreach, which is a very small town, about 7 hours west from Rockhampton, with 2 staff in an office in a town of probably 5,000 people. So we provide services across most of the areas kind of discussed today. So we provide disability services under the NDIS, aged care services under home care packages, common folk support program, veterans care, transition care program, also a disability program in Queensland called Queensland Community Support Services, which is kind of a scheme for those who don't quite fit in the NDIS. So it's quite a broad range of funding of our services across the workforce. In the community care space, we operate our services using a single workforce of support workers who support clients across all of those fundings. So that does lead to a whole lot of complexity when it comes to the regulatory requirements, the compliance requirements, but particularly the funding requirements. We might provide personal care, for instance, to a client, and depending which funding bucket they fit under, the requirements in terms of what specifically that service can include will change. How we might bill the client, or if we bill the client, will be different and require a whole lot of different requirements around that. For example, under the veterans home care, clients are capped at a very small annual fee which they can pay, so they'll pay and contribute towards their services up to that amount, but then no more. Under NDIS, clients don't contribute at all. Student on supported home will have clients contributing from a very small amount up to 50% of the cost potentially, so it gets quite complex there. And then the government funding can change quite dramatically. We have programs, again, for that one personal support service will pay us from as low as $66 per hour up to over $100 per hour for the exact same service being delivered by the exact same worker, purely dependent on the funding. So it's a very complex environment to implement and to manage, and that has a whole lot of unintended consequences in terms of service planning, prioritisation, all of those kind of things. So it is a really complex environment when you start looking at all of those different things. What is fundamental in the same service can look very different purely because of the funding arrangements.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Adrian, you have a specific portfolio. You deliver NDIS, you deliver mental health services, and you are delivering psychosocial disability services as well. And it's a multi-funding model. You have some part of your funding is state funding and some federal funding. Could you talk on that? The diversity of the funding sources and bodies you operate with?
Yeah, so we have the bulk of our funding comes from the state government, primarily through the Mental Health Commission, but then we have federally funded money from the Primary Health Network and the NDIS. And obviously there's different reporting in each of them and different compliance and regulation. And for WA, our mental health sector is incredibly regulated. So for our services, for example, I guess this looks at the governance issue. We are at the moment accredited against the QIC standards, the National Standards for Mental Health Services, which will soon become NSQHS, the CMO standards. The Housing Authority accredits us in WA. We have the licensing department as part of the health department. The chief psychiatrist accredits us against the clinical care standards and the NDIS. And we need governance, absolutely, but the cost for us to be accredited against so many, and a lot of them are state government, so many standards, and for 80% of them they're basically identical. So there is a huge burden. If we think about, we always talk about how can we get as many dollars of funding to actual care, to resulting care. We spend hundreds of thousands of dollars a year on compliance and regulation. And again, I know that some of it is necessary, but gee, we can streamline that to free up more for funding frontline care.
Thank you. Can we get Catherine? Nathan? Catherine, can you hear me? Catherine? Hopefully she... Audio not coming back? Can you hear me, Catherine? Okay. Until we fix that, we'll come back to Rob. In terms of, yes, there is an idea of having, because you're dealing with so many bodies, but your care worker, as Daniel pointed earlier out in the earlier conversation, that it's the human life you are working with. The same care worker working across multiple service portfolios, but living almost the similar work or same work. What have you, in your observation, what are the key things of systems which can be aligned to bring them on the same page?
Yep, and I think that's a really important thing for this support workers, particularly on the ground delivering services. Every system has, at the moment, different requirements around case noting, documenting, alignment to goals, and limitations of what the specific service can provide, which does create a whole lot of confusion for support workers. If we are really looking at a system and wanting a system that's about what the consumer needs, then having that kind of focus and that being the priority of care planning is certainly a way that we try and bring it together for the worker in terms of having those care plans for each individual participant or client that outlines what they need. But having less regulation or complexity among each of them tied to the funding specifically is what brings in that extra kind of confusion. So having a system that was more about that client planning and broadening out some of those specific service definitions certainly is a way that can help reduce some of the complexity for workers.
Catherine, can you hear us?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes,
this is the question.
I can hear you well. Catherine, could you work in the First Nations space, specifically the early childhood sector, and you are the peak body. Could you talk about the work your organisation have done, and you've been negotiating with multiple governments on the self-determining governance system? Could you elaborate on that?
Sure, absolutely. So SNAICC, the National Voice for Our Children, is the national peak body for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children and families. We're obviously committed to all aspects of early education, development and wellbeing. So SNAICC was stood up about 4 decades ago, and it effectively was a whole group of Aboriginal community-controlled services, but also communities that came together and said, look, we've got a fundamental failing in Australia, and that is that where we've had horrific policy design, most of that horrific policy design has been targeted at children, and in particular Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children. And so up we went, and over the course of those 4 decades, our primary calls have stayed consistent, and that is that we know that Aboriginal children should be valued, that our children thrive when they're connected to their families, their community and their culture, that we need our children to be able to access early educational care services in the way that most families are able to access them, and we need to stop the number of our children hitting out-of-home care systems. So over those years, we've done it in multiple ways, and that is that we negotiate directly with governments on behalf of our services. What we've had in the last few years has been a fundamental shift in the opportunities available to us to genuinely push in on that systems reform, and that primarily has been the new national agreement on closing the gap. So I heard it referred to in the last panel, closing the gap as a policies response for government for 10 years didn't actually have any buy-in or say from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and the national agreement effectively says from here on in, when you're talking about Aboriginal service delivery, you need to be negotiating with people, and it's based around 4 priority reforms that start with shared decision making. So that's every single government in the country, from local councils to jurisdictions to the Commonwealth, all saying we know we need to do better, and the way to do that is to start with shared decision making, to change the way governments are working with us, and to change the way our funding models work, and to ensure that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community controlled services are the ones getting the investments that they need, and ensuring that we have access to the data sets that we need, because a lot of the things that Australia has been measuring have not been relevant to us. In doing that, there are a whole heap of actions that that sit under us, in particular the targets that relate to early education and care, and the targets that sit with out-of-home care. All of those things, we don't see them as separate entities. They're not mutually exclusive. To move one, you've got to be able to move the other. So effectively, that's the bulk of what we do. We represent the sector, we bring in their voices, we use that national agreement to work with state and territory governments in the Commonwealth, and we're really committed to ensuring that communities on the ground now have a say in the services that they're able to access. They have a say in the programs that they get delivered, that they're able to find out what it is that's happening around them, that they're able to evaluate what success looks like, and that they're actually able to build tables themselves where they can work with government in a different way.
Thank you, Catherine. I want to do a follow-up on that broadly. Mind my language is, I don't have the right word for it. You know, in the early childhood space, they say it's Aboriginal early childhood space and mainstream stream. And where the government defines the sector as early childhood education and care. In my conversation with mainstream service providers, they see their role as education providers. And in my conversation with you, you clearly outlined that you see the role of the early childhood providers as care providers, not just education providers. Could you put some light on that thought as well, and try to elaborate if you can?
Yeah, absolutely, Deb. So again, I think I heard a slight reference to it in the earlier conversation when we started talking about integrated and holistic service delivery models. So the Aboriginal early education and care sector effectively evolved under what we understand is appropriate early education and care, and that's grandmother's law. So grandmother's law is really, really simple. It means that if every child is loved, if every child has food in their belly, if every child knows who to go to get a hug when they feel sad, then you can expect your entire community and families to be strong. And that is basically one whole half of the Aboriginal law system sits under the umbrella of grandmother's law. And those early childhood services have said they've been functioning for more than 4 decades now. And they really identified that in current settings, our children not only didn't have access to vital early education and care, when they did have access to it, it was not culturally appropriate, not culturally relevant, and wasn't responding to the whole of child. So the Aboriginal service offering is very different, and you'll find elements of this in every single one of the sectors that works with Aboriginal people. But effectively it means you walk in there and you as a child and as a family are responded to. Everything that you need is available to you. So they don't only provide incredible early education and care, they provide access to those families who might be having trouble accessing food, who might be having trouble being able to access healthcare, they might be having trouble with housing. Those things are just integrated and natural in the way the services have evolved and developed and respond to their communities, because at the heart of them they are community-led and community-designed. So it is the gold standard in what we understand as holistic wraparound care. And you'll see elements of that even in the National Strategy for Early Education that came out of DSS last year. Those elements of understanding in order to be able to look after a child, you also need to be responding to the environment around the child, intrinsically embedded, and they get significantly different results. And again, one of the things that we've been able to leverage out of the national agreement has been better access, so things like removing elements of the activity test that was preventing Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children from even entering an early education and care service. We saw a little rollback at the beginning of last year. By the beginning of next year, it will be gone. So we're able to bring in that type of evidence to using what's coming out of those services to show what the incredible impact is to really help transform the early education and care sector, not only for our children, but for everybody's children at the same time.
Thank you, Councillor.
Deb, can I make a couple of comments?
Please.
I'm really envious of the fireplaces in the background there. I don't know why we don't have one here. But one broad reflection on funding, and this might be slightly controversial, I hope that's all right. But I've only ever worked in aged care, hospital and mental health. And what I observe when you see politicians talk about funding, they'll often, they love getting up and talking about a road. We're building a tunnel, and they'll often, we're investing, and this is it's going to have great dividends, and this is a jobs and growth economy. And then we're investing in submarines, God knows how much money. And when politicians talk about that, it's like this is a net benefit. We're going to see these long-term society changes. But when they talk about, it's many instances when they talk about healthcare, it's kind of like this, sunk cost or fixed cost. It kind of reminds me of, we went on a really cool holiday last year to Mauritius, and my son says, why don't we do this all the time? And, what now? Oh, we're only going away to Lancelin. Why don't we go? And it costs a lot of money. And then you say, well, why? And he said, look, we've actually got to pay bills and rates. And sometimes politicians, money spent in our sector feels like it's the boring stuff. It's like paying your power bill. It's like paying the rates. But gee, we can cut a ribbon for a tunnel. So I think there is there's some changes that need to happen in just the way that some government look at it. I think great point raised in that sometimes when we have lots of ideas that we want to pitch to government, and sometimes it's almost like if we are empowered to have a say, that we will come back with ideas that cost so much money and we're going to want no accountability. Now, what I should say is that I've mentioned that we get most of our money from the Mental Health Commission. Gladly, that's not the experience we have when we actually talk to the Mental Health Commission. It's very focused on how might we do this, how can we get the best outcomes. But I just sense this, and that's why I think the safe option for lots of government agencies is to do a largely internal review, and then they'll come up with their ideas, because it's almost like they can't trust us to listen. And the same as with Aboriginal communities and other communities, in that it's this fear that if we listen to people, they're going to come up with something that's going to cost a whole heap of money, and there's going to be no real outcomes, and there's going to be no accountability, which is just absolutely not the reality. I think there'll be so much better outcomes and more efficient and effective services if we are given more voice in terms of what would the money go to, what would the outcomes look like.
Thank you. Robert, picking up this question from Liddle, but I will frame it a bit more from my end as well. But the question is, how can we move from program funding and reporting to wrap around funding and reporting? Is this going to change to provide a holistic, person-centered service? And I want you to also talk on the idea of the person-centered. Across all the care and support sector, we use the term person-centric and person-centered all the time. And still, there are challenges in each of these sectors. So I think if you can use that question as an opening to talk more on that.
Yeah, I think that it's definitely something we reflected a lot, and I'm probably going more the community care space here, aged care. The home care package program, in its initial kind of idea back in 2018, was a really good way of doing this, and that each client was allocated an amount of money. There was some very basic rules of how it worked, but basically consumer choice. You sit down with the client, work out their goals, work out what they want, and you design the service in consultation with them to deliver that. And that's a system that requires, I think to the point you said, a lot of trust. And you kind of watch over the years, particularly the last 5 years, as the supported home reforms were initially announced as being quite big and quite broad, and again, client-directed, pick the people they want. And each iteration, they kind of got a little bit less, a little bit less, a little bit less, to where it's back to, here's a shopping list, here's your one main provider, here's how you can spend it, provided you fit within these categories. And we're kind of to a place now, almost we're back to where it was pre-Living Longer, Living Better reforms, back in the old days where it was the shopping list and the client can have what they want as long as it fits inside that shopping list and price schedule. So I think the real way to have that reform is to actually trust that providers with appropriate regulation and oversight that's effective and efficient can work with clients to use allocations, and I think having allocations is important, but to use those funds in a way that is actually tailored to what that client needs, and again, fitting within broad programs, but leaving the scope for those on the ground to actually design and deliver. And I think that's the bit that's really, I can see more and more being lost. You look in the NDIS space, the lack of investment in support coordination means they've taken out that ability for clients to work with support coordinators to design and deliver and pick the right people for their care, and trusting that the planning will happen at this end, the service provider will deliver. They don't need that support coordination, but actually it's such a vital part of finding the right fit, the right person, and the right support. So I think putting the money into that case, support at home has the same issue. Case management's dropped from 15% down to 10% under the proposed support at home program. Putting that investment in service design with participants is really that important aspect, not just focusing on the direct outcomes on the ground.
Thank you. Can I go to Catherine? Nathan? Yeah. Catherine, in the whole funding conversation, the work you've been doing, talking about transferring funding to ACHOs or Aboriginal community controlled organizations. Could you tell us the premise of that? And because that conversation is happening not just in early childhood space, it's also happening in Aboriginal controlled disability services or aged care services. So could you give us a premise and the understanding, so that, because if you are asking and you have a reason to bring it all together, so does everybody else, so you can learn from you guys.
Absolutely, yeah. So I know I referenced the national agreement prior in my last little bit there, and essentially what it was talking about there when it says transfer to Aboriginal community control. When you start drilling down into the closing the gap statistics, what you find is where Aboriginal services have been front and centre in delivering services to Aboriginal communities, we get a different result. But at this stage, say for example, in child protection, only a fraction of the 6% that goes into early intervention and prevention actually goes to the Aboriginal community controlled sector. Now, when you think about what we're actually up against in that particular sector, nearly 50% of children in the out-of-home care sector are actually Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children, and yet we get a fraction of any of the investment that goes into what is supposedly a child protection system looking after a child. And again, I heard it recently in your previous panellists when they were talking about, it's like the systems, when we look back on it, we're going to find that the systems were designed to hurt people. We don't shy away from that. We know very well that things like the child protection system are harming children, and governments know damn well that they're harming children. But we know that community controlled services will get a different outcome. So again, if you drill those statistics, what you find is where an Aboriginal service was involved, you are far less likely to see children being removed from their families. If they have been removed, you're far more likely to see children return to their families. Where you've got Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander early education and care services, you pretty much wipe out the need for tertiary interventions at all. So investing in the Aboriginal community controlled sector or community control just makes sense. Again, and when you look at where we see things going fundamentally wrong in the early education care sector, so I'm jumping sectors now, it's when we've had these, I don't know, I'm sure there was a good reason for it. I don't know what the good reason was, but I'm sure someone had a good idea somewhere. The profit-based model that early education and care is currently funded on here in Australia, I mean, that just doesn't make sense. When did we put profits above what we need in order to create a really safe environment for children, in order to be able to develop an incredible workforce that's investing in our babies? So there are some real needs there is a real need to look at where the system reform is needed. And of course, there are also those other evidence pieces that back that up, like the Productivity Commission review into the early childhood sector that said reform the system, start putting children first, invest into community controlled. It called out the ACO sector and said, again, I'm going to call it the gold model, look to the Aboriginal community controlled sector and what they've been able to do by responding to the needs of those services, change the funding model so that they don't have to pull holistic service delivery from this bucket and that bucket and that bucket, so that they're responding to multiple funding frameworks across multiple jurisdictions with multiple KPIs. It's just ridiculous. Transform it now and get really serious about moving away from recommendations and into genuine action.
And on that, can you also a bit more shed some light on the true cost of care? How does it goes down, and the cost of care calculations in terms of?
To be perfectly honest, Deb, I don't have them off the top of my head because every service model will be slightly different, and the work that we have been doing through the federal government on the ACO funding model, and again, it's while I say it was funded through the federal government, it's one that's on the radar of every jurisdiction, and it's effectively said stop determining what the bucket should look like and rather invest in what communities need, so that communities are able to design the service that's fit for them where they're at, and it's able to say, well, we might not necessarily need those 3 teachers over there, we might only need 1 teacher, but we might need more grannies in our rooms that are able to respond to our children. So that particular funding model gets really clever when it also moves into the Innovation Fund for Workforce, because it basically says complement that needs-based funding with an innovation fund that enables those communities to grow their own workforce based on who's in there, what skills they have, recognise those skills, wrap around those people so that they're being trained on country and that the supports that they need to be successful in that further education journey are all embedded into the place-based response. So there are some incredible new innovations about to hit the ground, but having said that, you still know that you need governments to push in on at the right time, and you can have every policy policy window open, and all you need is one of those to close shut, and you go from about to hit the ground to, geez, that was a good idea, why didn't it ever land?
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Now, Robert, I want to pick up this question from Slido. Is genuine co-design of services and programs from consumer engagement in conflict with the funder compliance, prescriptive grants and limited funds? Is genuine co-design of services and programs in conflict with compliance, grants and funds? And it says thoughts, question mark.
I don't know that having frameworks in which you operate, agreements to what we'll deliver in terms of, there always need to be limits and controls in place. But I think, again, if that's done well, it doesn't have to be conflict. It can be, I guess, the framework and it's how you use what you have in design. And again, it comes back to that trust and that ability to let people actually experiment and work through it and do things. We operate the Commonwealth Home Support Program, which has, it's very much you have X number of outputs to deliver for X number of dollars. And that's really the important program of meeting a low level of care of need, but it doesn't really respond well then to more complex needs because it is quite restrictive and very, very limited. You can't scale up an individual because you've got a block in generally across the country, they're almost always fully utilised. So when you're at that level, it can become quite dangerous, I think, because you have really clear needs where a little bit of extra work can make quite a big difference to someone, but you just can't deliver it because you've hit that barrier. So, I mean, they can be challenges when there are restrictions and limits and quotas, but again, I think equally, for there to be trust, it needs to go both ways, and the organisations need to be doing the right thing, and for that to happen, there needs to be shared understanding of what that right thing is, and that's where having those frameworks in place can be important to build and sustain that trust.
Thank you. Adrian, I will pick up another question from Slido. It says, what are the state and federal government doing to address mental health needs of individuals who have opted out of NDIS, aged care and other care sectors?
Okay. The federal government is doing precious little. So there's no other way around that. Just if you look at the last budget announcements, it is absolutely pathetic, to be honest, what the federal government is doing. We signed the bilateral agreement. Lots of services were sucked up as being in scope, state and federal services into the NDIS. For those who will remember, Partners in Recovery is a great program at FAMS and absolutely fantastic. And we were assured, given every assurance in the world, that all these people would get the best possible care, no one would be worse off. And then, surprise, surprise, all these people started transitioning and they weren't eligible for the NDIS, or they got 1 or 2 hours. And then for 5 or 6 years, the federal government said, no, it'll be all right, it'll all work out, these people will get the best level of care. Well, they haven't. And so I guess I could give you one great example. Because the federal government assumes that block-funded services are just going to be inefficient and we're going to be lazy and we're going to waste time and money. So they think, activity-based funding or fee-for-service or NDIS, that's how we're going to get the best bang for our buck. So an individual who used to be on FAMS or Partners in Recovery, we could just do whatever support we needed to care for these people. And sometimes that is keeping them out of hospital. Remember, the most expensive place possible to have someone is in hospital. So we'll have someone on NDIS, it's like, well, gee, they're quite unwell, we're going to take them to the doctor. But we're not funded for that anymore. So what we have to do, and when you're supporting people with significant mental distress, they want to go to the doctor with a family or a friend, they don't have many, or one of our staff. But so our option is, okay, well, what we can do now is we can say, well, we're not funded for this, so we're leaving, and you can make your own way to the GP, or they'll become increasingly unwell and get an ambulance to hospital. But we make the decision at our loss to say, well, look, for the betterment of this person, coming back to the moral question, what's right, we'll take that person to the GP. We won't get funded, we have to, that half a day we don't get funded for. And so that's one prime example where we have a federal government who is not listening to what is actually happening on the ground. Someone somewhere is dreaming up these ideas that are just totally incompatible. And part of it is that when you're supporting people really unwell with mental distress in the community, their care needs are not highly predictable and perfectly planned. I remember when I was a physio in a hospital and someone comes in for a knee replacement, this will happen, that'll happen. After 3 days they walk, 5 days they do this, and then they're discharged on day 6. And 90% of people fit into that. That doesn't happen in mental health. And getting this message across to the federal government that people experiencing significant mental distress, they don't fit in a nice little box. There's not this care pathway that's planned within an inch of its life. It's been incredibly difficult to get that through. So I guess the two things from the federal government, just the money is not there, and they don't listen to the planning pathways. For the state government, there's been significant promises, and we need to, over the next 3 years from the state government, see a dramatic increase in the number of residential beds. So if you go back to the 10-year Mental Health Commission plan we had in 2015, the state government has dramatically failed to meet the target that they set, and both sides of Parliament in WA agreed to it, and they just have not delivered the number of beds. So the people will often talk about, we need more hospital beds, and that's not just in mental health, but also more broadly. If you look at the data, Australia's got a lot of beds per capita for hospitals. What we don't have is really good community care and community residential beds, and I know I'm preaching to the converted here, but that's where we need to see more investment.
Thank you. Catherine, if I can get you on this question from Slido. I live in regions which speaks over 230 languages, different languages. How are others improving care and cultural safety for culturally and ethnically diverse regions?
Yeah. Look, again, when those regions are able to design the service delivery that they need, and I'm glad you raised block-based funding, because block-based funding is something we always lean into. We have a lot of trouble getting that language necessarily across the line, because people think it's a model that has no accountability built into it. But in actual fact, the sectors that our peak works across, every single one of them, the dollars are there, they're just going in the wrong spot, they're misdirected. So what would happen, say for example, you've got your juvenile, and I know I'm preaching to the converted, you not know this story already. The cost of putting a child into a juvenile detention centre averages out at about $1 million a year. Child protection, those dollars pretty much similar actually. So what would be happening if we were starting to genuinely transform the system, pulling those dollars back in and then being able to invest them in community-led solutions where those communities were able to respond to the needs on the ground, develop their local workforce. So that meant if you've got a problem in that there's 2 or 3 languages, maybe 30 languages in a region, then you're genuinely developing a workforce that's able to either work in those regions or in those services, or be translators in those services, or be connectors to those services and the services that might flow out of rural sponsors. Again, when we look at the holistic service delivery models of our child and family centres and our Aboriginal early education and care centres, they will do that. They will have those things inherently built into it. So if you've got if the current model requires that you have to have a teacher, often the teacher might not have, might only speak English, but the families that you bring in and the community workers that you bring in and the care support workers that you bring in often will have those languages, not only those languages, but the sensitivities to understand what they might be dealing with when families come in. And a lot of families in regions where there is high vulnerability are really, really struggling to deal with the trauma in their own lives and the social poverty that is attached to that. So you're not only getting a better response to being able to communicate to people, you're able to better communicate what is going on around that child, what is going on for that family, and then get them the supports that they need. So that was a really long way of invest in your local communities, ask them what they need, and start the transformation journey that says, let's look at where we're not getting good bang for our buck and genuinely service those communities in the way that they should be serviced.
Thank you, Catherine. Could you also give your concluding remarks from there? On reshaping funding and governance.
Oh, look, that's easy. What would it look like if we genuinely put children ahead of profit? That one's really easy. Children ahead of profit. But what do they need? If you solve what children need, you solve what families need. You should ensure that your communities are strong, and we're going to get a much better outcome. And that conversation that people like to lean into, community safety, that is how you build community safety.
Thank you, Catherine. Robert, concluding remarks.
Yep, I think we always start our reform journeys with a lot of optimism of what can be achieved, and through the process that can often get eroded away by some of the outcomes and decisions being made. But I think it's about at least going into the current series of reforms and what will no doubt be future reforms, optimistic and trying to drive that concept of person-based centre care, which I think the plan talks about, and that really importance of having the scope and the freedom within funding to be able to support what individuals need, knowing that if we can support that individual now and the earlier we can support that individual, the more cost effective that really is going to be in the long run. And the importance of just maintaining that the organisations and the services that provide those supports are themselves sustainable and viable as well.
Thank you. Adrian?
I've been involved in the NDIS from the very beginning. So one of my favourite jokes at work when staff say to me, this NDIS is a bit of a mess, or when are they going to sort this out? One of my favourite jokes is, no, I'm sure that soon they'll announce another review or inquiry and they'll fix it this time. It's not going to happen. So we need less. We don't need any more reviews and inquiries. Actually, just need to enact what the sector has said. I guess around the governance, I want to highlight that many governments think that more regulation and more compliance will lead to better outcomes and safer services, and that is not always the case. We are drowning in over-compliance and over-regulation. So free us up to do the work that we want to do, that we're actually good at, and actually listen to the sector and back us in when we say this is what will actually work. That would be my overriding sentiment.
Thank you. Thank you, the panelists. Thank you, Adrian. Thank you, Robert. Thank you, Catherine, for joining us from up north. Thank you all.